for joining us for this session. Before I introduce Dr. Rhodes, I would like to remind everyone, as Mimi just did, that there is the Q&A section. Please do be asking questions if you have any questions at all. I think it makes it a lot more engaging for everyone, and everyone benefits from your questions. So please make sure to avail yourself of that feature. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Donna Rhodes, Director and Principal Research Scientist of the Systems Engineering Advanced Research Initiative at MIT. And she'll be presenting updates on CERC research task WRT-1009, Model Curation, Innovation, and Implementation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Rhodes.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to give you some highlights of research that we've had going on within the CERC for a few years. This is model curation, innovation, and implementation. And let me set the stage with you by saying that model curation is somewhat future-oriented, and I'd like to share with you a kind of an envisioned future under which you should view this talk. So the envisioned future I'd like to propose here is that we will have curated model collections in organizations, or possibly collaborative collections across organizations. And not every model that everyone develops will be in a model collection, but some models will end up being very valuable intellectual property. And these valuable models are the ones that will then be purposefully accepted into a curated model collection. And such a collection would be governed by a model curator role, which is most likely some kind of function or board that performs this governance activity. And that these models are then discoverable by model consumers. We can use technology in this envisioned future so that we can enable discovery and curating models for individual model consumers, for what they care about, what their individual preferences are. And these collections are going to be valuable only if our models exhibit integrity and are perceived as credible. And for much of the talk today, I'd like to focus on the latter, because it's not worth building collections if people do not trust them. So this we envision as kind of the future, where there are existing model curation, or there may be curated model collections today that exist, say, within individual business units, or maybe in a program, but largely we're talking about the example where these collections will exist at an enterprise level. So for those of you who've not been introduced to this subject before, let me just give a very brief overview. So curation has multiple dimensions. It's a practice. There's a formal practice, and curation practice exists in many different fields today. And in this work, we've drawn from these different fields like institutional curation, digital curation, data curation, and so forth, to look at some of the practices that would be applied in model curation. So for two examples of these would be model accessioning. This is a formal process by which a designated authority, maybe some kind of committee or governing board, will decide whether a model should be accepted into the enterprise collection. Similarly, at some point in time, a deaccessioning decision is made so that the model exits the collection. Another valuable practice that exists under model curation is acquisition and loan. That we're increasingly in this position where we may want to share models with, say, our partners who are also in our competitors in a different program, and how do we handle all the intellectual property? So we envision a model curator as having the role to decide on these things and set policy and so forth, as well as evaluate models. So as well as a practice, we can think about this as a role. And Again, I'm talking about sort of a role as an individual, but in most cases is probably some kind of body of individuals that comprise a model curator role. So in this role, you can view this as similar, say, to uh, an art museum where there's a top curator and they have responsibility for this whole collection. They set the valuation of those assets. They arrange for strategic loan and acquisition of different paintings. They oversee it. They set special collections and so forth. So now think about the idea of having a collection of these very valuable models with the same kinds of activities. The decision of whether to put a model under enterprise curation is going to be driven by multiple factors. And we've been looking at some of those by examining curation in other fields and thinking about it in context of our own fields. These may include things like the level of importance to a program or to a strategic business strategy. It may be that we want some greater control or protection on the model as a piece of intellectual property, or we want to retain that model as objective evidence for a long duration. And it may be that we want to control access. But most importantly, we want to enable sharing of work that's been done and that is possibly useful to others in the future. So we envision that model curation applies to these longer duration models of kind of two flavors, I think. One would be things that are used in our future digital twins, models that exist out into the operational phase of the system. And then another would be kind of like baseline or reference models, might be a reference architecture. These are models that we're going to envision as being useful for repurposing and reuse in other circumstances. So that's briefly what is under model curation. It's a role, it's a practice, it's criteria that are used, and it's also curating models for consumers. So that means we don't display a model in one way, but we may display it in such a way that it's useful for the needs and the preferences of the individual consumer. So with so much under that, we can't talk about everything that's been done in this research, but I want to focus basically on two things: the criteria for placing models under curation, and then model credibility, which is a long research topic, but looking at that through the lens of model curation context. And I'd like to then end with a few thoughts around the innovation, the transition activities that we've done, and future research. So in thinking about an enterprise model collection, it's very important, if we were to build up large collections of models, that they are satisfying some common set of criteria, so that we know that we can assess them in such a way that we understand their readiness and their acceptability for that collection. We developed this set of criteria under one of the CERC research projects, this one that I'm talking about, WRT-1009. And in related work that is the work that some of you may have heard Mark Blackburn talking about this morning, we applied the criteria to the Geyser surrogate project system model in such a way that we could just kind of test it out and develop an illustrative case. This is very important to have these criteria, because if we want to invest in a model collection, we have to make sure of a couple things. One is it's not going to be free to maintain these models, to make decisions on these models, and to have an enterprise collection that can be valuable to those people within the enterprise. Those benefits have to outweigh the costs. And also the models have to possess integrity, and they have to be perceived as credible. Here are the 6 main criteria that we have looked at so far in this research. They include this, how much relevance does an individual model have to enterprise or mission, the completeness of the metadata, the data, and the documentation. And I've called out separately, although one could combine these, the idea of model pedigree. So model pedigree is having to do with the human-ish information, the who originated the model, who's updated the model, what kinds of assumptions went into it, what kind of context has it been used under. We haven't always carried that kind of information as part of metadata. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. There's also the criteria that says, is there potential for redistributing or reusing or repurposing such a model? What are some of the restrictions that we have? Are there any human subjects issues? There's lots of things that could come under that decision. And then we want to make sure that the model we're accepting for our collection is unique and non-replicable, because if someone could easily just replicate it, why bother spending the resources to make that part of a collection? And then, of course, there's the economic business model. Here's a list of the sub-criteria that will be available in the slides, but for each one of these 6, we've elaborated some sub-questions for that, and these take it down to a next level. In the Skyzer surrogate model, then we created this illustrative hypothetical example. DoD has established exemplar model collection that's going to be used for defense-related research and education. And in this model collection, these models, these exemplars, are available to any authorized user who wants to use it for research or education. So we kind of set the context for that. And then we spelled out some roles. By virtue of this, we said, okay, here's the scenario where we're going to now say, will the governing board for this exemplar model collection accept a given model into it? Would it accept the Skyzer system models? So for the Skyzer example, which you can view in the CERC report for WRT-1008, you can see that for every criteria, we've kind of tried to address that as if we were actually making that decision. For example, under subcriteria D, whether security and risk have been considered. And in this case, since it's a surrogate pilot model, risk and security are not really an issue because this is already publicly available information. So there would be a different type of answer, of course, for every different type of model and collection and the circumstances of the enterprise that controls it, whether that is a government agency, a company, or something like a consortium or a professional society. So with that, when we make a decision that says our model is ready to be accepted into the collection, comes the issue of whether that model will be used and trusted. There are not many model repositories like this that I've run across. When I have seen some things that have been tried, it's often an issue that an enterprise would have, say, 150 models in a collection, but they say, well, only 10% of them are used. And so why is that? How can we make sure that we put the right models in our collections, and how can we make sure that people trust them enough to use them and reuse them? So in that light, we have been researching model credibility as sort of re-examining this. It's been looked at, many times over the years, and we know a lot of things about model credibility. And so we wanted to go back to some of the legacy literature in particular and take a look at that and reflect on how this relates to model curation in our fields. And one of the things that, of course, becomes obvious is that model credibility is something that really crosses all of these facets that I've been talking about in curation. It has to do with the practice. It has to do with the leadership that governs it. It has to do with the infrastructure, the repositories that we store things in. It has to do with how we present information to the model consumers, and then what kinds of enhanced innovation things do we offer, augmented intelligence, et cetera, to help us discover models. So credibility is important to all. Let me highlight a little bit of some of the key findings that come out of this long history of model credibility research. Kane in 1976 separated model credibility into these two distinct things of validity and value. And in this case, he's assuming verification. And he noted this kind of viewpoint of saying buyer seller. I think that's a good one for us to think about, that we have a model consumer and we have a model provider. So that relationship is very important, and there are certain dimensions to that that we'll talk about. But largely the credibility of the model in this case, he found, really is much related to the quality of the match between the modeler and the model user. Now, a couple of years later, Gass and Joel, this comes out of the OR community, looked at model confidence, which in a later paper, Gass also kind of used credibility as an interchangeable term there. They said was not an attribute of model. This is essentially important. Credibility is not an attribute of model. It's an attribute of the model user. It's the model user's perception. Gass and Joel came up with 7 different confidence criteria in their work. And one of these model demographics was subsequently a year later labeled model pedigree, even though maybe demographics might have been a better term. But you can see here what the information in pedigree would be about. And that turns out from our studies in model-centric decision-making and trust to be extremely important information. We make decisions on models, we believe models, much more based on social factors than the technical factors. Velsey in 1986 came up with some comprehensive guidelines for assessing credibility in simulation results. And I think this is also very important work for us to think about, because it shows that assessing credibility takes place over the life cycle of the model development. And it also suggests from this work that it's not only important that we give a model consumer transparency into the fact that the model was validated, but that we reveal to them what these series of validation activities were. How did the validation of that model happen over time? So it's something to think about as we decide, well, how do we make validation transparent to our model consumers? The the state of the practice, the state of the art work on model credibility, my views in the NASA work and the NASA standard for models and simulations. And over time, this work, which Steele in 2008 wrote about in a paper, talks about 8 relevant factors of credibility. The credibility work by NASA has gone on so that there is a appendix in the latest update of their standard, which includes credibility assessment. If you have an interest in this and you haven't looked at the standard, I definitely recommend it. And in 2015, a paper by Devin kind of captured a schematic of what is in the NASA model. And what's important here, I think, is that we have to view credibility as this kind of complex relationship of credibility of not just the model, but credibility of the data and credibility of the model use itself. So it is, it's a fairly complex situation. An additional area that turns out to be very interesting is the work that's gone on website credibility studies. This was in the early 2000s by Fogg and colleagues at Stanford. And they found that credibility could be defined as believability, and it was based on trustworthiness and expertise. And one thing to keep in mind is that the websites at that time were very different than they are today. So the websites at that time were kind of static and they were dense with information. You can equate that then with a digital artifact. So a digital artifact, then, if we judge the credibility of it, it turns out that things like websites were found to be more credible if the user perceived that there was some kind of real world organization and real people behind it. And that again is why pedigree becomes important. And that if we're talking about a model or its respective digital artifacts, that if the user, the model consumer, cannot identify who was the originator and who kind of like authorized this model as part of the collection, then they won't trust it as much. There was a side finding out of this FOG work that said that users found websites less credible if they experienced technical problems. And that's a lesson, I think, as we think about repositories. If we have a collection of models in a repository and it's just so difficult for people to use it, their perception of credibility is going to be diminished. More recently, we've done some empirical studies in the systems field. I'll just cite a couple of. One in 2012 was Genevieve Flanagan's work with Ollie DeBeck, and they were looking at model confidence, distinguishing model confidence from model validation. And there were a number of very interesting findings out of that work. And one hypothesis that was validated was that it's a more trustworthy model author, and transparency in the governing equations would improve the perception of that model. That it would make people trust that model more. In a CERC study that we had a few years back, we performed an interview-based study with model experts, and we really found that a lot of consistency with Flanagan's findings, and we sort of confirmed that the experts do believe model credibility is a perceived quality, not an attribute of the model. And we also found in that study that credibility is influenced by tailorable transparency. In other words, I don't care totally maybe about all of the transparency you can give me, but I want to know that I'm able to access what's under the covers of a model if I want to. And model pedigree was also shown to be very important in what we found in this study. So what do we do with all this? We had some other sources as well that we looked into, but we tried to take all of these findings and formulate them into what we call 3 precursors to authoritative source of truth. So for us to trust models, a collection of models, digital artifacts, these things have to be kind of precursors. You have to have that first. You have to believe these first. So the 3 are, briefly, model credibility being the attribute of the model consumer, not the model itself. And under the covers there is that the expertise of the model consumer themselves also influences whether they trust a model. The trust in the expertise of the originator, like if you know who developed that model and you have a lot of respect for that person's modeling abilities, you're going to have higher trust. So in the case where we may carry models over a longer period of time, we'll have to make sure that we can somehow retain enough information about a model originator so that a person accessing that later in time will be able to also judge how much they would trust an originator. It's true also that the individual propensity for trust varies in all of us. Some people are more trusting than others in general, and that's also going to come into play. And I've already mentioned this complex interrelationship of the data, the model, and the use of the model that was represented in that Devin schematic. Precursor 2, perceived model credibility shifts with the model consumer's experience context. And that's especially important now, I think, as we're heading through traditional systems engineering to system of systems engineering to mission engineering. Context changes, and context of use of an individual consumer may change as well. So under this precursor, we found, for example, that the credibility of the model and collection is going to be influenced by the enabling infrastructure that they use, that speaks to how much investment we might want to make in such a repository. It's about the expertise of the governance authorities. So it would have to be a very, scholarly body there that was judging things to say whether or not models were acceptable into a model repository. So, and we would need to be able to carry that information with the model. And then, of course, the perception of credibility is also somewhat related to just whether you think a model is going to produce value to you at that time when you need it. It might be a very good model, but we've seen through the past studies that you may believe a model less just because it's not going to give any information that you care about. And the third one, perception and credibility can change over time through the model consumer's interactions with it and with models in a collection. And so this implies that effective communication between model and consumer is important, and we have to think about that as both active and passive. Active happens all the time, but once something goes into a repository, we have to somehow figure out how we capture, say, conversations about a model so that they can be accessed by future users. We also have to think about modelers who reuse, enhance, and change a model, and carrying all that information that I've described with that as well. We saw through Balsi's work that the cumulative assessment of these interim activities matters as far as what kind of transparency they get into it. And different model consumers have different capacity for how much transparency they want. And then finally, as I said earlier, the experience you have, how easy is it for you to discover it and retrieve it? If it's totally frustrating experience to find a model that you might want to reuse, you're already starting from a point maybe where you don't trust this quite as much. So it was very interesting to see all of these common themes coming out of the legacy literature, as well as some of the more recent studies that have been done. So let me switch to just say a few notes about innovation transition and future research. There are some innovation related projects out there now that are very interesting. The biomodel community has long had repositories for models, and so it's interesting to see how they are moving from manual curation to automated curation. There are all kinds of other examples out there where people are using things like machine learning or some of the power of visual analytics to create stories, and also the technology itself of how you would interact and produce visualizations that matter. So I think there's a very rich opportunity to research this idea of innovation. Ultimately, these kinds of newer technologies could be very useful for us if we want to be able to, for example, discover models that are in a collection, compose models, put them together, customize model information for consumers. With this project, there were actually a number of technical exchanges and small collaborations that crossed over all of the services. And if you want to see an example of where some people are trying to push this kind of thing ahead, I'll refer you to this recent paper in the Conference for Systems Engineering Research. And in this case, it was the Army CCDC Armament Center that was trying to say, hey, what kind of operating procedure would be appropriate if we were going to undertake model curation? And they also, I think, made some progress in trying to think about what kind of metadata would be carried. And in this case, they included some of the pedigree type information that I had identified, like the creator. They included that in their metadata sets. So this whole subject is quite complex, and I think that as a community, we're going to benefit by sharing all of the things that people are trying to do that would come under this umbrella of model curation. So where's the future research? I mean, there's just so much, I think, that can be done. We conducted this empirical research study that was interview-based a few years ago on model-centric decision-making and trust, and it just was a wealth of information. And I think that doing an interview-based study on the topic of model curation could be of great benefit to our community. There is also an opportunity to look at what the interrelationship of model credibility and data credibility are. Data credibility, there's a wealth of information on that as well. We know there's a relationship here, but I don't think we've examined that sufficiently for our field. The question of valuation is an interesting one. I described for you earlier the idea of having a museum, an art museum, where the curator was responsible for basically putting a value on a painting. How would we put value on enterprise level models and even on, say, a model collection? That's an open area. I'm not sure that we'd be ready to put any real dollar numbers on this for a while. I'm not aware of anyone that's doing this, although there probably are pockets of people who have done this. But I think using some kind of 5-point scale approach or something could be a step in the right direction. The idea of accreditation we've looked at briefly. We think that there's a lot there to be looked at with the relationship of model collections and how what we traditionally do under accreditation practices can come into play. And I'm personally very interested in the latter two, which are how do we actually identify different types of model consumers that would benefit from models in a repository? And then how can we figure out what information is most important to them? What is their preference for how that information is displayed? What kinds of technologies can we bring to bear to help us with that? And I think the far-reaching envisioned future is that we can have digital demonstrators, and these would then be the cases where we had a model repository with 1,000 models in it. We could select a few of these. We could somehow put these together, and we could do something like, let's say it was a bid and proposal opportunity. We could actually put this together fairly quickly and then demonstrate new system capability. So that's, I think, the far-reaching end of what could be possible in research. There are some of the references if you want to dig deeper into any of these, including the CERC reports. And with that, I will end here and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rhodes. We do have one question in the queue here from Mimi. She says that you mentioned that model credibility is an attribute of the model consumer rather than the model itself. So how do you feel educating the model consumer plays into the development of the model? What role does education of the consumer play in model development?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think that there's a lot to be done with educating. I work with a lot of students, and I see where we educate students on, how to build a model, but we really fail to educate them on the fact that the social factors are also important. And so I think that starting to educate even at the undergraduate level with this broader perspective that there are model developers, there are model users, and sometimes we call them model consumers. What's the difference between these? What's the relationship? So I think that that's one element of it. And the other is that as model consumers, we also kind of need to be educated in terms of what do we look for? Maybe there's a lot of factors, like some of the things I've discussed, that we forget to actually think about when we're deciding whether we would use a model. So lots of dimensions to that question.
Yeah, hey, I kind of had, oh, it looks like there's another in the queue already. Oh,
Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just curious because I think models have become such a hot topic, especially with folks referencing the models for coronavirus and things like that.
Yeah.
What have your thoughts been on kind of how that's played out?
Well, I think among other things, I think that there is a really difficult thing when we have this urgency. We get in situations where there's just an urgency to have models, to develop models and maybe adapt models that have previously been developed for our situation. So there's always that trade-off, that risk of how much benefit will we get from a rapidly developed model or a rapidly adapted model to what are we going to do with that? And so I think that one of the things that brings up is the importance of understanding whether, for example, I'm interested in reaching into this collection and pulling out a model. Do I want that to help me in making a decision, like that's maybe early on and it's not locking anything into stone? And that another case might be I'm going to use this model to decide on how I should create the entire vaccine distribution plan for the country. I mean, there's no easy answer around this, but I think that it's very important for people to understand the context under which they're making the decision, and really poke at the model itself without just saying, oh, here's a model. And people that don't understand models as well as some of us do will just kind of like not have a way to even start querying whether they should believe the model or not. So that's why I think it's important to like crystallize some of this and have criteria and teach people about what it is and how to use it.
There's almost a need for kind of even beyond engineering, a general education of the public in interpretation of models and developing this ability to judge the credibility of something. Definitely, maybe with your question about the coronavirus stuff, it seems like people they see a chart and they're like, that's the truth, you know, whereas the person who developed the chart probably doesn't think that, they're like, that's a guess. So, yeah. Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. My question was, it's related to Mimi's question as well, but how should model curators ensure that correct models are also perceived as credible? Because obviously credibility is important if people are to use the models, but a credible model or a model that's perceived as credible that's wrong isn't ideal either. So
yeah, I mean, I think so this is kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? So my initial reaction is that we probably want to make sure that it's correct first. And that's why in this research, like early on that Kane did, he said, I assume verification, and now let me think about validation. Because yes, there's this danger that we get so enamored with our trust and credibility that we forget to say, does this possess integrity, and is it correct? So we have to have both of those. And I'm not sure if it's the same persons who decide on that, and maybe different ones. But I think that kind of gets into Jeff's question that I'm looking at here. Do we need to read these or?
Sure, yeah, I can read this one. So I think his latest question here is essentially in the military as well as in other domains as well, people are kind of conditioned to trust sources of authority and to embrace hierarchies. So how does that play a role in model credibility, and has research looked into kind of authority structures as it relates to perceived credibility? If I'm understanding that question correctly.
Oh, yeah. Okay, there's two of them there I'm looking at. So so you mean, I think the assumption is to embrace hierarchy of individuals who would decide on whether these are credible models. We have not looked at that, and that we have found in studies, for example, that people have said things like in our empirical study, investment wise, there's been so much invested in this model, I have to trust it. And that's sort of a similar thing to, if I'm understanding this correctly, that the model has acceptance at certain levels, but maybe not by those at a different level. And you're getting into a lot of like political kinds of implications there. There are just like, in my mind, so many more dimensions that we need to think about this. And having a curated model collection in the biomodel community is totally different than having one in the US DoD community. So there's a whole another layer of things that are going to come into question in terms of making decisions on model credibility. I see Jeff also had a question about the implications on how it might be hard to find the curators themselves who can handle this. And that's one thing that I've been thinking a lot and talking to people a lot. I think the only conclusion I have is that there is no person who could ever do this job. And that's why it has to be some kind of, governing board, I think. And that I've had some interesting discussions with other people in the CERT community about this in terms of what kind of people would they be, and would they be in that position permanently. And my belief, that I'm speaking as an individual here, would be that there's probably a need to have a standing governance body that gets augmented with the right kinds of people for the given model that you're trying to make a decision on. So you need some kind of stable governing people, and then you need to augment that. The question, I think we have to start doing some of this to actually truly find out how we do this. But that's why I position this whole thing as the envisioned future. I think we're going to start maybe on a different scale. I think it might be easier, for example, for us to create a collaborative model collection that we use in research or education. And we have a group of curator governance body that consists of representatives from different places, but it's always going to be a function of who's making that decision.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that is a tough one. So this concludes our time. We actually went over by a few minutes, which is, I think, okay, because the next session doesn't start until 2:40. So thank you so much, Dr. Rhodes, for your presentation, and for everyone in the audience with your questions. The next